as we live our day-to-day lives, a lot of what we care about are not things that are anchored in physical reality. We wouldn't say that friendship is strictly like a physical phenomenon.
Hey, humans!
Hi! So, Mickey, what's the Galactic Demystifying Science Alliance going to talk about today?
Well, how about we find out a little more about the extra scientific ways humans have come to know the world around them.
What? What do you mean other than science?
Well, humans have many different ways that they learn about the world around them. For instance, it seems like human science falls short of explaining why something is valuable. And so it can't really protect things like the oceans, forests, and asteroids from being quickly consumed for industrial ends.
Yup.
But methods like poetry and music, different modes of interrogating nature, help humans understand meaning. See, a lot of human interactions can't be captured in a simple physical explanation. Life isn't always as simple or physical as a chemical reaction.
Yup. Science usually can't explain why something is meaningful. It only really deals with how it happens. To help us, I found a human scholar named Dr. Ruoji Tang, who has some ideas about other ways of knowing that complement science really, really well.
Cool! What's her story?
Well, she spent many years studying the relationship between science and poetry. Her pursuit of the subject began when she was an undergraduate in English and philosophy at a place called UC Berkeley in the state of California.
Cool.
Afterwards, she went to Cornell University, where she earned her doctoral degree in British Romanticism.
Romance? Like courtship?
Not quite. It's actually an era of human poetry that stresses the importance of imagination and emotion. It was a reaction to the elevation of objective reason that happened during the Enlightenment. During graduate school, she looked deeply into the cleavage between poetry and science that happened around the time of the Industrial Revolution. And in this model, Romantic poetry actually serves as the basis for modern ecological thought.
Ecological thought. That must mean how humans protect their planet and species in a world where profit and growth are the loudest voices in decision making.
Exactly. Her work attempted to identify the thread woven through poetry that could help produce a non-monetary interpretation of the value of nature, something that the humans are really struggling with today. But she isn't just a scholar of poets. She's a polyglot who speaks Mandarin, French, and German.
Wow.
She was a writer at Strange Horizons and an editor at Beijing's Economic Observer. Today, she continues the difficult work of being a human in two different worlds. She's a senior associate at Long Neck Thunderfoot in New York City and an editor at Wall Street Journal China Magazine.
Wow.
In addition to all her professional efforts, she's also developing her passion for film and analysis into a yet unnamed podcast.
Cool. Looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Well, I'll let you guys know when it first appears.
Yup.
So, let's call her up, Quinn.
All right. Ring a ding.
Go get it. Hey.
Hi, aliens.
Hi, human.
How's it going? How is it out in space?
It's pretty dark.
Kind of cold.
Not a lot to do.
I've heard that about space.
They warned us before we started, but I don't really listen when people try to warn me about stuff.
That happens sometimes.
You're very different than the other human we talked to last week.
How am I different?
Well, he had hair all over his face.
Oh, so do I.
You have hair on top of your face.
I see the difference. I don't have like this hair, right? The facial hair.
I have hair all
I
over
would
my head and
say,
face.
oh yeah, you do. Do you come from a cold place? Does it keep you warm? All that hair?
It's
Not as
actually a good mechanism of heat diffusion. All the hairs have little capillaries in them, and so we actually sweat through the hair. It's disgusting in the summer, but very effective.
Hmm. Yeah, we've got creatures with hair here too. They sweat too.
Humans?
Humans have some hair, but like there's like animals that have more hair.
I see.
Yeah.
Do you study these animals? Are you a scientist?
I'm not a scientist, no. I am
Are you an engineer?
But you're a doctor, right?
I am. I am a doctor of philosophy, but I am currently just a normal working professional.
Wow.
I'd love to be a normal working professional. I'm stuck in this can with Mickey.
But you guys are doing research, right? You're researching humans. It's kind of like being a working professional.
The benefits aren't as good.
There's no difference between work and play on our planet.
It's all
Really?
work, no play.
It's all play.
I see. So there's actually some confusion about what work and play are.
It
Well,
certainly seems that way at this point.
What can I do for you, aliens?
Well, you're a different human than the one that we spoke to last time. He was an engineer. And you say that you're not a scientist. I didn't
But-
really realize there were other kinds of humans. Did you, Mickey?
I think she studies humans too, but not with science.
Whoa.
How can you study things without science?
Yeah, I guess you could say I used to study humans. But mostly what I studied was poetry. So it's a little different from science. So not so much focused on, as I understand it, objects, but more focused on language,
Wow.
the
What
particular
about-
ways that it's used.
Interesting.
Do you have poetry where you come from?
We do, but
How do you define poetry?
we really like human poetry.
This is true.
And your music.
Well, music is kind of like poetry, but it's got a tune.
We're trying to
know
understand why
if
you
I
guys are
can-
so good at it.
Why we're so good at music and poetry? Why, thank you. I don't know how to offer any insight into that, but I think it's like, I guess you could say that poetry is one of the fundamental ways that humans understand themselves or come to like confront who they are. It's very hard to offer an exact definition of poetry. I think poetry has defining features, for instance, rhyme or meter, but it also differs across cultures, so it doesn't necessarily have to have any of those things. That's generally true of Western poetry.
Does it help you understand things about the world?
Yeah, I would say so.
Is it more about understanding yourself or understanding others, do you think? Or
I
neither?
would say that it's difficult to have a concept of self without some conception of like the not self.
Like the world outside of you.
Sure. Or any kind of concept of inside or outside. I think you require some kind of immersion in language. And so poetry, I would say, would be almost like the primordial version of what that is. A kind of like a kind of like condition for any concept of inside and outside, of self and world, any the that precedes almost these kinds of distinctions.
Whoa.
So, what do you think is the difference between science and poetry? That's a big question. Does that question make sense? Can you ask that question? I ask that question.
I would say that science, well, I mean, historically, so scientific inquiry and poetry have been pretty closely joined. So poetry has been, there's a tradition of poetry that's didactic, so that you would learn scientific knowledge through poetry, because it's kind of easier to remember when there's a kind of formal linguistic structure to I guess you could say something like observation. But I would say now, the way that we think of poetry and science now, they're quite distinct. So there's a way that scientific experiments are set up, and there's a way that scientific research is done in institutions. And the way that we study poetry is, I think, for the most part, still kind of archival. So we're looking at poetic objects. So we're looking at poetry through text, through manuscripts, through archives, but now also on the internet. And there's also live poetry. So the media is a bit different. But I think science still requires words, and it still requires a kind of understanding through language. So they're still connected, and they share a history. So that's bound to kind of circle back.
They both tell stories, right?
Yeah. A lot of poetry does tell a story, but I think poetry also doesn't necessarily have to tell a story. For instance, poetry could be more about sound. It could be more about how something looks on a page. It could be more visual. It could refuse to tell a story. For instance, it could just kind of stutter and stay still. So there's a lot of options when it comes to poetry.
And that stuff would teach you about humans?
I don't know if it teaches you about humans. I think it's a form of knowledge, but I wouldn't say it presupposes anything like a human.
Can you tell us a little more about the shared roots of poetry and science? That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, sure. So if you go back a little bit in history, so like a couple hundred years before that, we have concepts of modern science as you know it. You have forms of science that are more closely tied to things like agriculture, and you have poetry that's kind of about the agricultural cycle. So here, poetry is also conveying forms of knowledge, but at the same time, it's still very much an art form. So it's very much about the kind of the art of composition. And I think if you go back a little bit more, so in the Western tradition, you have things like Georgics that kind of communicate agricultural knowledge and forms of scientific knowledge, but that are also very much kind of a poetic form. So poetry was kind of, if you will, like the privileged like vessel for delivering what we would call scientific knowledge, but that was a little bit different. And it's also a form of, actually, probably a better example of this would be something like philosophy, where you can have a philosophical poem that would teach you things, and that would also qualify as science. The philosophical poem?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure if people still write philosophical poems. That's a good question. I think it's definitely not the most popular form of poetry written today. Yeah. But I wouldn't say that nobody's doing it. And it's still a popular form, I would say, to read.
What's philosophy?
Ooh.
Good question.
Because we were talking to this scientist a few weeks ago, and he thought the physicists were doing philosophy, not physics.
And he thought that because they weren't really studying objects anymore. they were talking about concepts, mathematics, these theories of the universe that no longer related to physical objects. They were kind of what if stories, things that couldn't be tested. And he called that philosophy. Do you agree?
I think I think without knowing more, I can't say I agree or disagree, but
That's fair.
it is like it's a helpful way, I think, for science to define what it's doing is to distinguish itself from philosophy. I think this is like a popular way to say to distinguish science from other ways of knowing. But philosophy is quite general. It's just, I mean, if you trace the root of the word philosophy, it's love of knowledge. So it covers a kind of a broad set of things, right? Many things can fall under the umbrella of philosophy, technically speaking. But I think today, to say something is philosophy could be a pejorative term because it's saying that it's not grounded in a kind of scientific method, that it's more speculation. And I'm guessing that's what your scientist friend meant.
He didn't really have a definition of philosophy. It was interesting.
But I do think that you're right, that it was sort of viewed as this distancing from reality. And it may have been a criticism.
From physical reality.
Yeah. A common criticism is that it's not useful, that philosophy is not useful. It doesn't help solve problems.
So, do you think there's more to reality than physical reality? And like,
Yeah,
poetry might be a better way of handling those things?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think just as we live our day-to-day lives, a lot of what we care about are not things that are anchored in physical reality. Or if they're anchored in physical reality, the parts that we care about don't correspond to physical phenomena. For instance, something like friendship is, yeah, it's anchored in physical people for sure, but we wouldn't say that friendship is strictly like a physical phenomena, right? That would be a strange thing to say. Or love, or conflict. I mean, or grief is another one. A lot of poetry is about grieving, about something was there and is no longer there, and that's something that isn't really about physical phenomena. So it's not quite about presence or what's in front of you. It's about what's gone. So yeah, I would say a lot of our lives are taken up by these preoccupations that are not strictly speaking physical, and that I think poetry can speak to better, and that's poetry is much more preoccupied with.
So, it's like concepts. Like, philosophy deals with concepts, and science deals with objects.
But it sounds like old science, well, old poetry, maybe dealt with objects more. So there seems like there was a division,
Like a bifurcation at some point.
a split between poetry and science. Old poetry occupied both roles.
Like,
And
the old human philosophers also did the science and the poetry.
That's true.
Yeah. I mean, that's like one of the big kind of overarching historical theories about what happened, in modernity. Why are all these forms of these distinct disciplines formed, and how come they don't actually collaborate with each other, and they're not part of one single quest for knowledge the way that maybe ideally we'd like them to be. That's definitely one theory about historically what happened. And I would say that I wouldn't say that philosophy deals necessarily only with concepts, right? Because philosophy is very much interested in perception as well. It's very much interested in observation. It's what we know, how we know what we know. What are the questions that we're asking? So philosophy is very much concerned with this. And I wouldn't say poetry is really concerned with concepts per se, but
But how we know is
this
the
might
concept,
be,
right?
What's the
Those are
concept?
concepts, though, right?
What's the concept?
How we know what we know.
It's a concept? I guess so. It's more like a
I mean,
it's more
it's
like
not
a
an atom
question.
or something, right?
Oh, okay. So anything that's not
Atomic.
anything that's not a
Physical.
thing is a
A
concept.
shape, yeah.
Gotcha. Well, a shape is a well. That's where it gets kind of fuzzy, right? Because atom was a concept for the longest time, right? It wasn't like a thing, and we can't really see it. So technically, it is a concept, and even things are sort of concepts as well, right?
They're conceptualized as we encounter them, right? We can only think of them as concepts in some
I
way.
suppose so. Yeah, I suppose so. And I think one of the questions is what are the terms of encounter, and that's something like all of these things are interested in. I mean, science is interested in it, poetry is interested in it, philosophy certainly is interested in it. Like, what does it mean to encounter something, right? What is it to encounter nature, to encounter another human, to encounter? There's a lot of questions kind of just bound up in this idea of encounter, and there's different ways of looking at that.
I think that might be why modern science in humans has a hard time playing with poetry. Because there's the sense that if you start asking the question about how we encounter or how we know or what that means, that you slow down progress. These are messy questions that don't have clear answers. And if you can just use a simplification to say that there are concepts and there are objects, and the objects are the only ones that can take action.
Objects that exist.
Objects that exist.
Because, of course, you got unicorns and leprechauns. Those are objects that don't exist.
But so if you start to ask the question of how do we know the object exists, you have to spend a lot of time wrestling with that.
You have to
And
locate it.
That's true, but how do you know that you've located the object, right?
Okay. Yeah. I think so. I think so. There's like already, I think you're outlining sort of a division of labor, right? So if the scientist is like, we have a scientific method, it works. We know how to observe something within like an objective framework. So there's almost like no need to reinvent the wheel there, right? So we're not like, asking the question, we observed X under a microscope. We don't need to ask the question of well,
What does that mean?
Do we really know that X exists? Like, this is actually a division of labor that happens. And you say, well, that's a philosophical question. We're not concerned with that question. We're concerned with observation and what we're seeing and what it means. So yeah. I think you're completely right. So if the focus of science is to like make progress and accumulate knowledge, you have to like set boundaries and say, we're not concerned with these questions. We're not concerned with those questions. We're concerned with these questions. And I think that is what modern science does.
And it seems like there was this distinct cleavage that happened where science and poetry went off in different directions, and they haven't really found a way to interact very much in the world. Do you see them interacting much?
I guess I would say that like poets that I know or people who write poetry are very interested in science, but I wish there was like a little more interest the other way around. If we could see poetry actually contributing to scientific study in any institutional sense, that would be super interesting. But I'm not quite sure it does, and that might just be because of like the way that scientific study is done, the pressures of kind of producing something useful and producing something for industry. There's a whole pipeline of like making useful things for humans. So yeah. I would say, yeah, there's a division, and you feel it when children go to school. You have different subjects, and you have to pick the subject that you want to learn more about, the subject that's going to become your profession. There's definitely a dividing line.
Why do the scientists and the poets get doctors of philosophy? Doctorates of philosophy.
It's a good question.
Why do science? And I think there's a lot of reasons depending on who you are and what you're interested in. Some people are there to research a problem, right? They have a problem they're interested in. Some people are there because they have a more general interest in the material. Some people are there because they like to teach, or others have very clear professional goals of what they'd like to accomplish. I think there's like a ton of reasons for why people pursue doctorates.
But why is it all in philosophy?
Yeah, why isn't a doctor of science or a doctor of poetry or a doctor of buildings or computers?
Well, technically, it's those things too. It's like you do have a PhD in a field. But philosophy, again, coming back to the kind of the older definition or understanding of philosophy, love of knowledge, right? This is a kind of expertise in a certain field of knowledge. And knowledge does cover, conceptually at least, it covers all of these things. They're all, I guess, valued forms of knowledge in some way.
Sort of different ways of knowing, though.
Yeah, different ways of knowing. Exactly.
Is there a thread that links all forms together? Or are they broken apart by subject and remain separate? Because in science, there's this focus on understanding cause and effect.
Mechanism.
Phenomena happen, there are reasons for it, and we shall study them. Do you feel like all disciplines that pursue knowledge seek to understand the question of why? Or is the question of why not useful in all disciplines? In poetry, do you seek to understand why?
Like cause.
When one studies poetry, I think so. Poetry, at least as I understand it, the starting point is language. It's not going to be a thing, and it's not going to be causation. I don't think it's quite as interested in causation, or necessarily needs to presuppose causation to make. And it doesn't even have to presuppose making sense, right? Poetry doesn't have to make sense. But it does have to have some kind of, I guess, linguistic marking, a kind of sign, a language. That's kind of your baseline with poetry. It's not any of the other things that we think hold the world together, like categories of causation and categories of explanation, like why, or for instance, like if it's a poem mostly about grief or mourning, it might not give you a reason why. So you could ask the question, until the cows come home about why someone is gone. But poetry isn't writing a poem about it, reading a poem about it isn't gonna offer you a reason for why. So I think, often it explicitly doesn't, and that's part of the takeaway, I think.
So, like on Earth, when someone dies, can you hire a poet to help you out?
That's an interesting question. I think you definitely have conventions that where people turn to poetry. I'm not sure there's a professional hiring of poets. Some people do, but for instance, when someone dies on Earth, or at least in the countries that I'm familiar with, when someone dies, there's a ceremony of some kind, and the ceremony is sort of sending them off, whether to the next world or potentially to nothingness. We don't know. And there's a kind of saying of goodbye. And many people turn to poetry to either express their grief, to say a goodbye, to mark the occasion in some way. So yeah, poetry is part of these types of ceremonies, and funerals and death is definitely a significant one.
So it seems like poetry is a mechanism by which humans can understand emotions, maybe?
I guess it doesn't presuppose that you'd come out of it with any understanding of emotions, but it definitely is tied to emotions, I would say.
What about the experiencing of emotions rather than the understanding of them?
Processing?
The sharing of emotions?
Digesting.
The communication?
It's kind of because these are all, it's interesting because I think these are all areas of inquiry for someone who's interested in poetry, which is to say something like, well, what exactly does a poem do with emotion? Does it express emotion? This is a legitimate question. Does it distill an emotion so you can see it? Does it make you feel an emotion? I think these are all like legitimate questions to ask about poems, and not ones that I can give clear answers about. But yeah, but I wouldn't say that it I wouldn't say that it gives you a clear understanding of emotion, in any kind of utilitarian way, if that makes sense. It's not like, oh, I can use a poem to use emotion like that. That's something that I don't think poems do.
Can you use a poem to feel less alone? If you have a difficult emotion or you have a difficult place in your life, are poems ways that humans use to sort of communicate to one another something fundamental that they all share?
I would say yes to the first. Many people turn to poetry in moments of loneliness, and there's a lot of people like to repeat the quote from this philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, like literature, all of literature is consolation. You could say literature definitely serves that purpose. So not just poems, but like prose. A lot of that is there to give you to help you hear another voice that's not your own. As far as how successfully this works, though, as a form of therapy, I couldn't say. You'd have to ask, I think, individual people. But I don't think I think it's a good question to say to what extent poems are successful in like reaching out and sharing something with someone else, right? Because after a poet writes a poem and someone reads it or someone hears it, it's like an open question whether you're experiencing something that the poet is experiencing personally, or you're experiencing something that, is quite unique to you, or you're experiencing, I guess you could say, a shared human condition. I think these are all open questions. These are not like exact answers. And maybe this is kind of, as I'm talking myself around to it, maybe this is kind of what things like poetry and literature are about. Is a lot of questions that we can't quite answer, but it's helpful to think through.
Do you guys send poets with the astronauts on their missions?
With astronauts.
Whoa. Like, do they go in space? Do you have space poets?
That would be awesome. I think there are poets who write about space, and I think some astronauts must be poets, but I'm not sure. We've had an incident where we were like, this guy's a poet, or this girl, this person is a poet, and let's send them to space. We haven't done that yet.
I think we should start working on that, Micky.
I want to be a poet.
What kind of poems would you write?
How do you become a poet?
That's a good question. Can anyone be a poet?
I don't know if there's a path. Yeah, I think anyone can be a poet. I think that's part of the greatness of poetry, is its accessibility, right?
What do you have to pay attention to be a poet?
You can poeticize. I would say the only prerequisite I can think of is reading poems. Like, you become a poet by reading poems and writing poems. That's it. Or maybe not even writing, right? There's an oral tradition of poetry, so you could just poeticize out loud.
Singing.
What do you think the
Singing
first...
is poetry.
Singing is poetry. All singing?
No, I suppose you'd have to have words. I guess you could have singing without words. I think poetry probably needs words. Or I guess there's sound poetry. I could be challenged on that. You don't need words, maybe.
Because I've read that for humans, music carries emotions. So if a poem allows you to experience something inside of yourself, and music can do the same thing, are they related in that way? Just sounds that make you feel things and the words that make you feel things?
Hmm. I think poetry can definitely make you feel things, but I wouldn't
Which came
say
first?
that music or poetry.
Or poetry or feelings?
Music or language?
Oh, that's interesting. I have no idea. I couldn't possibly say what came first. I want to say music. I want to say. I think there's a lot of interesting poets who write about their speculative origins of how this came about. Whether there was music and then there was poetry, and whether this is actually the evolution of a single art form. So I think there's definitely something to be said about music coming first. But as far as feelings go, it's hard to say. I don't know if poetry necessarily has to make you feel, but it definitely can.
Who's your favorite?
Who's my favorite? Oh gosh.
Who's your favorite alien?
That's what I was going to
My
ask.
favorite alien? Oh.
I'm joking. Who's your favorite poet?
Who's my favorite
Obviously,
poet?
I'm your favorite alien.
Oh, that's such a difficult question. I don't know who my favorite is, but I would say right now I'm reading Dante. So that's up there.
Dante. Who's
What?
Dante?
Oh, don't ask me about Dante. I'm not prepared for this conversation. Ask me next time about Dante. I'll come with some
Okay.
notes.
I had another question about the relationship of science and poetry and knowing, where you mentioned earlier that it would be nice to see them working together. And it seems like science is preoccupied with these questions that can be answered, and poetry might be preoccupied with questions that are very difficult to answer.
Difficult or impossible?
Maybe impossible? What do you think?
I would say that I feel like there's probably some great takes on this that I'm not remembering, but I would say that it's not so much like I would say that they're not abstract questions that we wouldn't think of, or they're questions that they're not abstract questions about things that are sort of out there, very little of it is asking. I mean, I think poetry can concern itself with questions that we're either asking already, or questions about things that we take for granted. things that are quite close to us as well. So I wouldn't say that it's like necessarily things that don't have answers, but I would say it's often things that preoccupy us. For instance, like a lot of poetry is about things that preoccupy us that we struggle to understand, like even things we know about, like the passing of the seasons, right? The kind of the cycles of day and night, which is something that we know something about, and the regularity of which, we've historically always known about, even if the science wasn't quite there to give us a kind of like to give us a more detailed explanation about the movements of the earth and so on and so on. I think like there's a way that you can say, I know that summer passes into fall and into winter, but there's also a kind of, even when you express that form of knowing, there's also something not knowing that you start to express there, because part of that is the fact that the seasons are turning, but what does that mean for me? Or what does it mean that I'm maybe at the same place, but the seasons are changing, and what does it mean that I'm getting older? So there's a kind of a sort of experience that starts to be expressed that's quite close to us, but at the same time is maybe like asking questions, even as it conveys forms of knowledge, if that makes any sense.
Meaning.
Yeah, something like meaning that doesn't proceed from knowing. Exactly. So meaning that often proceeds from something that we don't know, something we don't quite understand.
I feel like science often asks the question, what does it mean? But then answers it with objects. What does it mean for this thing to happen is answered by saying, well, like breathing. What does it mean to breathe? It means that you take in oxygen, you take in carbon compounds, and then you connect the two of them across the cell membrane, and you are able to perform the work of life. And so there's this very easy answer to what does it mean to breathe? Not necessarily easy. I understand it took humans a long time to figure out. But it doesn't answer the question, what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean for time to pass? What does it mean to grow old?
What does it mean to only have so many breaths?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm gonna go write that down.
I don't know what that means.
Well done. He'll be back eventually. But my question is how to incorporate these forms of knowledge. You're good?
On my way to being a poet.
Excellent. How can we include these forms of knowledge in science? How can we blend them together? What does that look like? Science is obsessed with progress. It wants to move forward at all costs. To build something new, to make something better, to move into the future. And the question of what does it mean to be alive? Well, that's not a future-oriented question. That's a very present-oriented question.
Very personal, too.
Certainly. It's hard to generalize that to, well, this is the meaning of being alive, and it is for everyone. So say we all kind of thing, How do you incorporate that into the study of how things work? It might make you smarter in terms of planning for the future, right? Because I know a lot of humans are obsessed with this idea of living for forever. We live for a long time, thousands of years. And it's not always a great thing. There's a lot of different problems that living for forever makes. There's a lot of problems that you have to solve before it becomes functional. And the question of what does it mean to be alive is an important one to answer before you move into that future. But it seems like humans aren't doing that. they're busy working on how to live forever.
Yeah. I guess I don't know if I have an answer to like the big question of how do they work together. I think there's probably a lot of promising work being done on it. I'm trying to think of like a good example, but I think often.
Have you ever seen poets working with, geologists or oceanographers or any of these sorts of hard sciences?
Do the poets teach them how to talk?
Or how to see the world?
I think, I mean, I think on a general level, there's definitely, so if we're thinking about the early days of geology and we're thinking about kind of the advent of modern geology, in the 18th century, you definitely saw a lot of like cross dissemination of thinking between poetry and science, and poetry then being a way to kind of advance scientific inquiry as well. And you also saw, because the tradition of geology also comes from various forms, but one of which is kind of sacred geology. So geology very much tied to Christian theology and the movements of the planets as kind of ordained by the creator. So in that respect, like modern forms of geology are still very much they still very much have their roots in a certain type of thinking that we could say is quite literary or quite poetic. So yeah, like there's been a lot of historically there's a lot of joined thinking, let's say. I think today there's definitely still interesting things being done. I think whenever you're doing field work, you're always and again I'm speculating because I'm not a scientist, but I assume when you do field work, let's say in a new place, if you're going to, and wildly out of my territory, but if you're going to the Amazon or something, you are working with local people, you're working with local forms of knowledge, even as you come with a certain set of institutional knowledge. So I think that's probably where it's most promising, and that's probably where you see different kinds of knowledge coming from different disciplinary, we would say like disciplinary categories really collaborating. So I'm sure you see a lot of it, but I would say that the focus on the end product is for science, I think is still like what the public knows is still how it's kind of squeezed out of an institution and given to you as a ready-made finding or a ready-made product. So I would say that.
And as an indicator of progress, right? So there's this institutional tendency to move towards progress always, and to create this story of progress where we move to the future. And I suppose Alphaflassians don't do this as much, but that's a different story. So it seems like human institutions are obsessed with this idea of progress, and going to, say, the Amazon and working with the people who live there and incorporating their knowledge almost always means that you have to question, what does progress actually mean?
Yeah, I would say that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure poetry has to be as like committed to ideas of progress, and I'm not sure it really is committed to. I mean, it's not under that obligation, but I do think that the way that we do science, we're always building on prior studies. So yeah, there is a kind of like a presupposition of progress, even if it's not as big as like a commitment to a narrative of progress. There is a method based on progress.
And you're trying to learn how to live?
Oh, I think that's part of a certain kind of moral philosophy is living the good life. How do you live well? And what that means. What is the good life? I think that's a big part of philosophy. But I don't know about, I'm not sure if poetry ever teaches you how to live. Or literature doesn't quite teach you how to live either.
So how do you humans learn how to live? Sounds terrifying.
I don't know. I'm curious how aliens learn how to live. No offense, I mean not aliens, but like
I'm taken.
I
Well,
don't think we really.
we're not allowed to give away all our secrets.
Gotcha.
It's against the
so
Federation.
Well, we can give a
I don't
little
want to
bit.
pry.
We can give a little bit.
You know what the boss said?
Oh, look, the boss has a lot of opinions. He's not here. Micky doesn't like to share. But I think that we learn through cultivating a sense of ourselves. Where Avaflossians are taught to create an individual sense of meaning that also takes into account the larger whole. Does that make sense?
Gotcha. Yeah, I think so. Like, kind of balancing an individual sense of purpose with like a more collective sense.
We try to think about the future a lot. We're taught to think of the impact that our decisions will make on things that haven't happened yet. And the sort of negative outcomes. You have to think through the I was going to say replications, but that's not the right word. The ripple effect of what you do. And so it can't just be good for you and, the person who's maybe standing next to you.
Has to be like a collective good. Gotcha.
In some ways.
Sort of radiates outward.
It's been a lot of stops and starts. Sometimes it goes better than other times.
Yeah, I bet. I guess there's probably some of that here. There's always always a lot of talk about collective versus individual. But as far as learning to live, I think one learns to live in a very, in some ways one doesn't learn to live, one lives. But in other ways, you take your cues usually from your environment, the people around you, your contact with forms of knowledge, of course. But I think a big part is your family, the people that are around you as you develop. All of these things are part of how you, I guess, learn to live. But mostly you live, and you make mistakes, and you sort of learn from those, or you don't. You just keep living.
Sounds like engineering to me.
Yeah, there's a fair bit of that. Fair bit of like trying to get something to work. And sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't.
Can you engineer with poetry?
Like use it to build things?
Can you build a better world with poetry?
I like that.
Oh. My hunch is no, but I think other people might differ on this. I don't think poetry makes the world better. But I guess it could. It could be part of something that makes a better world, but I don't know if it like impacts making the world better in any straightforward way, I would say.
Well, then why do it? That might be an Alva-Flossian question.
Yeah, I think it's less like, it's not especially utilitarian. I don't think humans are super focused on always making the world a better place, or even focused on that very much. Wow. It is something that comes up a lot, but yeah.
What do you think of that, Micky?
Well, if it feels good, it's a better place. For me.
The poetry?
Yeah.
Do you think it feels good to write poems?
I think it could. Yeah.
Feels good to read them.
It's true.
Especially.
Yeah. But I don't think it has to be either of those things. I think as I'm describing, it feels like I'm describing something quite nebulous. But I just think you have a lot of liberty within poetry. It doesn't have to be really one thing or another. I think honestly the most important thing is just reading poems in terms of writing poems and being interested in poetry.
What would a future that took into account the knowledge gained from poetry and the knowledge gained from science look like? What does a future with multiple forms of knowledge look like? Or a present with multiple forms of knowledge?
Or can they be unified?
Yeah, I like this idea of unification you mentioned.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that they would be unified in any sense. That sounds a bit terrifying, like some kind of giant like
The one knowledge
monster. The one knowledge, this knowledge monster. No, I'm not especially into that. But I think like I'm not sure poetic knowledge is cumulative. I mean, poetic knowledge comes with a tradition, right? So poetry can kind of like reach for its own particular tradition. So where your references are not forms of history maybe that we take for granted, but a kind of poetic history that you can trace through poetry and the poetry that the poem has read. So that gives you a kind of unique look, I would say, at
Like an
it gives you a
ancestry.
unique sense of knowing. Yeah, like an ancestry and like any kind of endeavor at ancestry, it's going to be very fraught and very uncomfortable, right? It's all ancestry is something that does make us feel like anything that's ours maybe isn't uniquely ours, and there's a lot of anxiety and unhappiness that comes with it as much as illumination. And I think it's something similar like that to that with poems. But I wouldn't say that the knowledge you get from poetry is cumulative. It's not. It doesn't build in any kind of clear sense. And it's not going to be encyclopedic in that sense.
Wow. That might be the biggest difference that I can see between science and poetry.
Yeah.
There's no endpoint.
There's no endpoint. It's not quite as well. It could be, but it doesn't have to be.
There's no end of poetry, is there?
Oh, that's a very big question. I don't know.
Because I don't
think so.
Okay. How come?
I think the temporality of a poem is interesting because you think about it. It's when something is written, it is something that reaches out for a reader. And we see this with kind of with archival work, is that something can be written long ago, where maybe its intended reader has completely disappeared, but it's still reaching to be understood. Even text that we can't decipher is kind of reaching out for a kind of for being able to be deciphered, being able to be read in some way. So in that, it has a kind of open temporality in the sense that it's never quite like a closed, it's never quite a closed system because it needs something to read it.
It's interesting that you say even the poems that can't be deciphered are still reaching out to be read. How do you deal with something like that?
I guess you have people trying to read it. I think if it's a lost language, you have people trying to piece it together, trying to read it. But knowing that the process is flawed and the outcome it's not going to be a complete and total understanding. A lot of it's going to reflect back the limitations of your own attempt to decipher. But that's, I think, a worthwhile endeavor.
That's kind of similar to science, actually.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. a lot of this describes scientific process as well. But yeah, but poetry, I would say, isn't quite directed toward. I just keep coming back to it's not reaching for a clearly utilitarian purpose, and it doesn't aim to make anything better or make your life easier.
So, on Alpha Floss, we think of science and engineering as different things, where engineering makes life better, but science just clears up the confusion.
Okay, interesting.
So, engineers sometimes draw on science.
They work
but
together.
Yeah, they work together. Sometimes even the same people are engineers and scientists. But
That happens here too.
the science is just the mechanism.
But poetry doesn't seem too occupied with mechanism. It's occupied more with meaning.
It doesn't have to be. I would say poetry, if there's a mechanism, I'm not sure you would say language is a mechanism, but you could say poetry is occupied with meaning making, I guess, in one sense. So
Sense
it doesn't
making.
have to be meaning. Sense making, but also nonsense making.
Whoa.
There's a lot of there's a lot that you can do there. So for instance, the basis for something like poetry is figurative language. And in some ways, figurative language is more foundational to our meaning making than what we think of as like, not exactly literal language, but the language that we use to serve a purpose every day.
Do you think that humans would have an easier time of it if all of them read a little more poetry? Is poetry for everyone?
I think poetry is for everyone, but I don't think poetry would make people's lives better or easier. I think it would make people different, for sure. But
how would it make them different, do you figure?
again, depends on the person, depends on what they're reading,
Sure.
depends on
what are some
their
ways
life.
that you can imagine them being different after reading poetry? Right? Knowing that this won't be a description of everyone or everything.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of a good
Micky's hair looks like it's changed after he wrote
example.
that poem.
I don't know how its impact on hair per se, but I think there is something about, like, you see in reading poem that there's a lot of dialogue between poets and poets that are speaking to each other.
Across
instance,
time, or?
Yeah, I mean, across time. I mean, it's a complicated process. Or actually not that complicated. Like, one poet will write something that introduces the work of a prior poet that's an influence, or even the poet himself. For instance, Dante writes himself into his journey and into his descent into hell, and his guide there is the poet that he sort of holds up as the epitome of poetry, which is Virgil. So there's a kind of I mean, in terms of impact, I would say that this is a kind of a clear impact, where not only Dante changes because of Virgil, but Virgil changes Dante has him into his poem. So yeah, there's a case in which both of these men have changed because of poetry, and the poetry that they very explicitly write, and writing in each other in some way into poetry, their own poetry. So
were they
yeah,
contemporaries?
Yeah, so they're not contemporaries. No.
I see.
Yeah. Virgil is writing about the kind of mythical founding of Rome, the Aeneid, and Dante is an Italian poet, so writing much later, but kind of looking for the origins of this kind of national epic in Virgil, and kind of like the kind of the kind of grand tradition of what poetry could be. And Virgil is one of the eminent examples of that. Virgil and Homer. And yeah, so but in certain ways, by writing Virgil into the Inferno, kind of our understanding of Virgil's poetry also changes a little bit. So there's an interesting contemporaneity, I would say, that can occur between texts that maybe can't occur between people, right?
Because
So,
they've long
yeah.
gone already by the time that someone else is
Exactly.
writing.
So it's like a
Exactly. They can't
conversation
literally
across the
meet each other.
ages.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly that.
Wow.
Science has
Yeah,
some of that
so-
too, right? Where people come back to old ideas and they explore them and they rewrite them, and
Not as much as they should, probably.
definitely.
Yeah, I mean, how many people are discoursing with Charles Darwin?
Right?
Like, yeah, even today, I think, yeah, it's definitely it's kind of just part of writing, right? And part of how we conceptualize writing, which is through authors and authorship.
But it's like the earth scientists only read the scientists immediately before them. But the earth poets read the earth poets way before them.
Yeah, there's this sense in earth science, not like geology, but earth scientists, that you can't go too far back in time because those people are somehow unreliable. They didn't have the right ideas. But it doesn't seem like that's the case for poetry.
That's a big difference.
Interesting. Yeah.
You rarely see scientists going back to biology in the 1600s or something, right?
Yeah, I think there's interest in that for sure, but I think it would start to look like something like history or history of science instead of, science proper, hard sciences.
Sure.
Yeah, but yeah, I think it definitely works differently.
Wow. My mind's kind of blown
Yeah.
right now. I think I need a nap.
What do you think the future should look like? Could look like? Do you have an ideal future?
Ooh. I don't think so. I think I have personal wishes, but
What are your personal wishes?
my personal wishes are quite personal. But they're probably mostly related to how I'd like my life to work out. But I don't know if I have any large scale wishes. I'm just hoping things are better than they are now. That's, I think, generally most people's wish.
It's a good
We're
wish.
alive in 2020. Yeah. These are not good times. These are not good times for Earthlings.
Well, we're on the case.
You're gonna help us out?
I think so. Maybe we should start writing poems.
I don't know if poems will help us out, but I always encourage people to write poems.
It might help us figure out how to help it out, you know?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, we have something to do for the next week then.
Maybe we can hang out whenever we get to Earth.
I'd like that.
I'll be here. I'll be on Earth. No plans to leave the planet
Are you sure?
in the near future. Pretty sure. Even if there are private space travel plans, I'm sure they would not involve the likes of me.
Would you go if somebody offered it?
Into space?
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I figure I'd have to train and get in shape and stuff. It looks like it's like a demanding physical experience.
So I've read that this guy, Elon Musk, is going to start a Mars colony.
I've read that too.
Would you go to Mars and live on
Would I
Mars?
go to Mars?
Yeah.
They probably need poets there, right?
And the studiers of poets, those who hold other knowledge.
Well, not really a studier of poetry anymore, but would I go to Mars? That's an interesting question. I think I would not be the first to go to Mars, but if they make it as easy as like going to Canada, I would go to Mars.
Okay.
I would be like, yeah, why not? Let's do it.
So not like on a one-way trip that you'd never come back from.
Not so far, no. But then, if everything goes like to crap on Earth, then who knows? Maybe I'd be dying to go to Mars.
I want to stop by when we get in the solar system.
Yeah, we'll report back how it is once we get there.
Yeah. Tell us how Mars is.
I'll take some pics.
All right. Shall we go
Collect some
deal with the
samples.
antennas?
I'm gonna work on my poems.
I'm gonna go stare into the void.
All right. Enjoy.
Thanks.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Safe journeys.
See you later.